Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, great to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two therapists talk about modern relationships. One of the maybe myths, Matt, of modern relationships or coming out of modern relationships, we often hear people say something along the lines of, I want to take a break from relationships because I want to work on myself. I've got a lot coming out of that relationship that I need to improve, need to work on. Something like attachment styles often get mentioned. I've got an anxious attachment style and I really want to work on that. I think it's fair to say we're coming into this conversation and have those conversations with our clients a little bit skeptical of that approach. Why don't you kick us off with maybe what you hear in the consulting room from individuals coming out of relationships along those lines, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I was going to set it up exactly the same way. Actually, it's interesting. We've not talked about this.
We
Uh,
didn't really prep for these conversations.
we sometimes prepare separately, don't we?
Yeah,
Just to just to make that clear that there is sometimes some thought that goes into these
yeah,
conversations.
definitely.
Um, Yeah, that's exactly how I'd have set it up because that's what I hear an awful lot of people bouncing out of a relationship or wanting to slow things down and wanting to work on themselves. And I think two things about it. One is that sometimes there's a bit of a defense mechanism there, isn't there? You've been hurt, it's a rough old trade, isn't it? Being in and out of love, falling out of love, having your heart broken, or, disappointing somebody else with whom you don't quite feel it and don't want to go the next step. So I think there is a little bit of self-preservation in there. So I don't necessarily always take it, at face value. I might take those things with a pinch of salt and sort of root around and see whether that really is the case. But I think there is a sincerity to that
Yeah.
perspective as well, that people want to get themselves secure, earned secure if they're into that kind of attachment language. But again, I hear the same as you. Lots of people talk in those terms, like they want to sort themselves out, do some work on themselves first. And I think it's, on the one hand, admirable and sometimes useful, and on the other hand, sometimes not entirely necessary. I also think it's sort of preparing for a match in very gentle conditions, because as soon as you go back into a new relationship, that's really where the test is. So it's sort of, I think you can prepare for a penalty shootout. You can try and create the stresses and the conditions that somewhat mirror the moment in the game, but it's pretty hard to simulate with complete, accuracy, like just what a relationship does to you, just how it pushes and pulls you and pokes you and triggers you and trips you up and, causes you stress and strain. When you're on your own, the risk is you're not actually doing the work.
Took you all of about 3 minutes this time to bring a football analogy into the.
And that's what we did talk about offline, didn't we? When we should have been talking about
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. So it was at the front of your mind. Fair enough. Yeah, I just coming back on some of those points. The My initial thought or question is usually along the lines of granularity, trying to understand what someone's actually talking about. Because as you say, I think there's probably two or three buckets, isn't there? One is around licking your wounds, which is perfectly understandable, and wanting to have a bit of time to process the loss and to understand it and to have a think
That's
about.
probably a good idea, isn't it? Would you agree with that? Bit of
we'd,
time.
we'd both be a little bit wary of someone who's bouncing from relationship to relationship without any understanding of what might have not been right about those relationships, or kind of what's so bad about spending a few months on your own as well. I think
Yeah.
we'd ask questions along those lines.
Yeah.
So there's something around licking your wounds, which I think is perfectly normal and understandable. But then there is potentially an avoidance of going back into those situations. And then finally, there's just this general sense of perfectionism, I think, in some of these
Mm.
conversations, which is I need to improve myself for the next relationship rather than appreciating that maybe it was just a bad fit for all sorts of reasons. You might be choosing the wrong people. You might have just been like most of us and gone through a number of relationships that weren't quite the right relationship. Does that mean you need to fundamentally change yourself to have a good relationship in the future? I think for an awful lot of people, the answer to that question is no, that the next relationship will probably pose a different set
Yep.
of
Yep.
different issues for you emotionally that you're probably going to have to work on in the moment in that relationship. And if it doesn't provoke anxiety, it might provoke jealousy, or it might provoke avoidance in you, whatever it might be. Different set of problems potentially.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess you and I would be wary of how much you can change as well. So that kind of idea of fit, I feel like this about work sometimes, that people want to change themselves for a workplace or for a particular assignment. And it might be that actually that kind of work, that profession, the pace of that, or, the way in which you need to be to succeed there might just be telling you that you need to do something else. You maybe dreamt of that, you maybe started off there, but it's not quite right for you. Because I guess we would both be a little skeptical of how much you can change. You can be yourself with more skill, but the personality science would say you are going to pull back, sort of rubber band, aren't you? You are going to pull back to a natural tendency. So I think you can notice things much more keenly. I think you can create a pause point and then you can decide to do things a little differently, but it's a little differently, I think. And um, you're not going to turn yourself through 180 degrees.
And I guess nor should you necessarily want to, I guess is the
I
point.
don't meet
Kind
many
of
people who I
perfection.
think like you need to fundamentally change. I meet lots of people I think you're lovely, or like if you could just show a little more of that, or if you could just curb
Yeah.
some of those excesses, I think this will be relatively easy for you, and certainly like, pleasant and good enough, which is all I'm aiming for really in a relationship anyway. The idea of, I think some of that is worth talking about perhaps, that there's an idea that if you're perfect, they'll be perfect, or the relationship will be perfect. And I think that's the bit that I would want to, just sort of query and question with people and wonder with them whether, what is it you're after? No rows, no crosswords, no differences of opinion, no somebody misunderstanding you sometimes, because that ain't going to happen. Read as many books as you like, do as much breath work, and go on as many retreats as you care to, but it will not make any difference to that outcome when you're up against another human being. They will see the world differently, and that will frustrate and irritate you sometimes.
There probably are a few areas of a personality, or if you do bucket it, like in terms of attachment styles and categorize it in that way, there probably are a few things that we would say it makes sense to want to work on and to try and improve upon, for want of a better word, or learn better skills is probably a better way to phrase it, isn't it? Learn a better way of regulating those emotions or acting from that place of anxiety or whatever it might be. I'd put kind of anxious or avoidant attachment at the more extreme ends of the spectrum into that at least kind of understanding what pushes your buttons and what alternative ways of behaving might be. I agree with your point that you might not succeed in changing those feelings that you get in certain situations in a relationship, but what you might be able to do is create that space to act differently and cultivate the relationship better, because you've got better skills in responding to who you are and what your default settings are.
Yeah, I agree. I think you can do that in real time as well, can't you? If
Oh,
you're
definitely.
I was thinking of like we play some sort of board games and card games with our kids, and often you're just doing a practice run, aren't you? You're doing the first round because you've read all the rules, and it's like, this doesn't make sense. And then you have a go, you do the thing, and it sort of makes sense. If you're teaching a kid to play chess or something, you wouldn't spend like forever telling them the formation in which the pieces can move, and you would get on with it in the game and kind of try and do it in real time, because one, it's more interesting anyway, and two, like, you do need to see the applicability, you do need to see the board, you need to see the game. You're not going to get all of that. You're going to get some of that much more than if you read a manual of, this piece moves in this way.
So just to draw on that analogy, you're saying that if someone, for example, finds themselves getting really jealous in a relationship, that their task is to notice their jealousy when something's prompted it in ideally in a relationship, and try and work with their therapist, work with their partner to find just a different way of dealing with and responding to that feeling.
Yeah, I think you can do. I mean, I think it's by degrees, isn't it? I think if that's really tripping you up and you're getting in a proper mess, or you've broken the relationship or done real damage, then it might be time to step back and think, how is this working? How is this playing out? Like, what is it that is prompting that in me? What is it that I go to do? Looking at the severity of that, seeing whether you could step in at any point, challenging some of the assumptions that would lie behind it. So, I mean, I definitely think there is a therapeutic task there for some people if they're up for it. But I think sometimes people get themselves in a knot when they're not perfect, or when they, occasionally get piqued by a thing, or, that's not the thing that I would end a relationship for, or suggest that somebody doesn't enter into a new relationship because of, I think you're going to enter into a relationship, two imperfect people, aren't you? You will end up, in my firm opinion, you will end up with somebody at the same level of emotional maturity as you anyway. Like, so you won't be doing great damage to them. You'll be muddling through this together. And I think if you put the right frame around that, we're trying this together, aren't we? We're doing our best, we're learning together, rather than we're hurting one another and we're damaging one another. And it's a judgment call, but I would say that's the distinction. Are we trying to learn something from this? Are we willing to do things differently? Are we going to be forgiving of one another and assume best intents? Then I think you can go at it, with a degree of oomph and vigor.
Yeah, what would you put into that category of things that is worthwhile working on individually, if anything, kind of with a therapist, on your own, outside of a relationship? Is there anything that you come across clinically that you'd say, yeah, it really is probably worth having a really good look at that? It's not something you can learn on the fly in a relationship with a patient person.
Yeah, I think the jealousy and anger was the obvious one. I guess that's what brought
Mhm.
me in on that point. That would be the one, that would be the one that resonates with me as well in terms of my life. Like, those things have tripped me up and have made me think I need to do something
Yeah,
before
interesting. Yeah.
enter into a relationship with somebody else. Again, something needs to shift. I think, just, I suppose, what we're problematizing a bit is the idea of perfection, perfectibility, or that there's an end state, but I think there is something about, actually, you need to turn that down. You need to get some sort of control.
What I rarely see someone where something like that is an issue for them only in relationships. So, yeah, if you take someone with anxious attachment, for
Yeah, yeah,
example, if they're expressing that anxiety and anger and jealous rage in a relationship, in my experience, it doesn't tend to be isolated to a relationship. There's someone that's destroying friendships. There's someone that is responding to strangers in the street, someone who's responding to a car cutting them up on the motorway or whatever.
yeah, sure, yeah,
It tends to be a kind of anger management issue across the piece that I think
yeah.
can be really effectively worked on in therapy.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I guess that for me would be, those examples that you've just given are sort of closer to learning to swim in a swimming pool. Is sort of the shallow end, isn't it? There's some kind of metaphorical guardrails in place. It's an easier thing. I think in a relationship, it hits you harder, it piques you more.
Mm.
So I think those are good. You wouldn't learn to swim in the open sea, that kind of thing. So I think sometimes, if that really is like a tempest raging in you, you need to step back. I think if you feel pangs of jealousy and you're anxious at times, and you worry that they've not texted you, and you worry that you've texted too much, or those kind of things, I think, can be worked through. And I think all relationships unfold in that way. The idea that we're perfect, or we've sorted ourselves out, we've dealt with our baggage, and then we can go forward, is just evidently absurd to me. Like, there are different phases and stages of a relationship which then need to be worked through anyway. So even if you're firing on all cylinders at an early stage in a relationship, or when you've got one kid, it's going to feel different again with two. It's going to feel different when you lose your job. It's going to feel different when someone gets offered a really exciting promotion in a different part of the world. Those are all phases, aren't they? It's different when your body's a bit older. Like, those things have always got to be worked through. So I think of a relationship as quite a fluid thing anyway, like with constant challenges attached and ever changing.
Well, one aspect that we haven't talked much about is self assertiveness, connection with a sense of self. That I'll often work with people that have struggled to get out of codependent relationships and have really been in the caretaker, caregiver role in relationships from quite an early age, including from kind of parents as well, potentially taking the adult role in their family of origin, and then going into romantic relationships, doing something similar, and then emerging into their mid-20s, mid-30s as someone who has rarely had to think of themselves, and having that space in life in between relationships of a couple of years to focus on their own social lives, their own careers, their own interests can really do wonders for then going back into a relationship and saying, okay, I've kind of learned how to advocate for myself. I've kind of learned on my own how to take care of myself emotionally as well, without having to look to another to take care of me. And I think there is something quite valid in that potentially.
Yeah, I agree. And that would be my experience of therapy. You can put this through a number of lenses, but the most straightforward reading, I think, of why I first went to therapy is because a relationship that I cared very much about ended. And I didn't really understand why. And I knew like some of what I'd done. I didn't really know why I'd done it, or, what was behind that, or what to do differently, or where any of those behaviors came from. And that was a very useful exercise. But I mean, I was in and out of relationships during that time as well. And that was useful too. And I suppose that's the way I've used therapy in my life as a client, so to speak. I've gone into it. I think I've taken some stuff from it, and then I've been quite keen to apply that. Even when I've been in therapy for longer periods of time, I've had a sense of, you've got to get out there and road test this stuff. Does it actually work? Am I any different? Because sitting and talking to your therapist about how calm you are and how, relatively more secure you feel about X, Y, and Z, I think you've got to test that stuff.
Yeah, and even when you bring the relational bit into the work, this is kind of inside baseball, so let's not dwell on it for too long. But there are schools of therapy, right, where you're trying to do the relationship in the room to some degree. And if you're angry with your therapist, you're talking about that anger and you're dealing with that in the room as it happens. But it's not all that can be really useful work, but it has its limitations, right? It's not as your romantic relationship at home. You're with your therapist for an hour a week, and if you destroy that relationship, you can find another one relatively quickly. Like, even if you care about it, it's not the same as a romantic relationship. And I do think it has its limits, even though it can be useful work.
Yeah, I agree. You're more than a paid stranger, aren't you? Particularly when you're working with somebody over a longer period of time. But I mean, there is something like that to it. It's not the same level of intimacy, I don't think. I mean, there'll be some therapists disagree with that stance, but I think you're right about that. I think something about just I was sort of just musing generally before we came on the call, and I was thinking about the Emerson quote, like sort of not taking life too seriously, not being too timid and squeamish, and sort of all of life being an experiment, and the more experiments, the better. I think there is something about that stance that generally disposes people to get more out of life and to accelerate through. If it is learning and it is improvement, then to accelerate through those things. It's a fail faster kind of approach, isn't there? I think, like, something very active. I don't think I have worked with anybody who's wanting to take a long sort of hiatus in any case, but I wouldn't encourage that long hiatus. It's like, okay, we've got a few tools in place. Let's try them. People are very scared of their emotions and their reactions, and I'm not sure we need to be quite as scared of those things. Sometimes I think you can do quite practical things about it. If you're seized of a problem, you've got some tools now that you didn't previously have for down regulating those emotions, or speaking about what you're feeling to yourself, to a friend, to the person you're with, whatever else it might be. I think you can afford to have a degree of confidence in that. What do you think? You buying that or not really?
No, I'm definitely buying it in principle, and you're fundamentally talking about exposure, aren't you? That's why we're generally advocates of people being in relationships with respectful, compassionate partners to try and work through some of this stuff with, because you're doing the exposure work, you're putting it into practice in relationships that matter. I do think often people are scared of the feeling, having to expose themselves to the horrible feeling, and almost the skills bit of it. Once they put it into place, they often reflect and say, that was easier than I thought it would be. It's the feeling itself that they don't want to engage in, but the actual kind of skills bit, or the down regulating bit, or the putting words to the feelings, once they've done it, I think generally they reflect and say, actually, that was a bit easier than I anticipated. It's confronting the intensity of the rage or the intensity of the jealousy is the hardest bit of the process of just going back into the arena.
Yeah, it's made me think that it's practice as well, isn't it? So if you've got a kind of, okay, what is this? I'm onto it. I've noticed it. I'm going to use these tools which I believe in. There is also something about how skillfully you can deploy them, and how with any new practice you would need to do it again, 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 before it becomes anything like fluent, or done to a sufficient level of
Yeah. Then it's a little bit different from your analogy of a penalty shootout, right? There's only so many times you can practice taking a penalty in the semi-final of the World Cup, right? You can't recreate that atmosphere in training every day, but you can in a relationship most days recreate elements of what you're talking about if you're not scared and avoiding those situations. So if you are someone that struggles with anxiety, there's probably going to be quite a lot each week with your partner that causes these little fluctuations in anxiety, that you've then got an opportunity to step in and practice something different, even at kind of 3 out of 10 rather than 10 out of 10.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. I'm not sure whether the analogy is holding, but you would still practice those penalties in training, right? You practice them over and over.
Footballers don't, stupidly, but yeah.
Yeah, no, legendarily don't do that. I think they probably do now, but definitely didn't as
Yeah.
we were growing up with football. And there was a sort of prevailing wisdom that you couldn't replicate the conditions of
Yes.
stress, so there was absolutely pointless. But now I think they are routinely burying them. And, Steph Curry is staying on the court and practicing free throws, and
And
do
the prince
thousands of those a week.
And the principle there is pretty obvious, and it's amazing it wasn't done in the past, which is that the more stress you put on something, the better it is to just fall back on something that you've done a million times before. Think about it. Your body will just take over, and you'll fall into defaults and routines in a way that if stress is put on you in a situation where you don't really feel like you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree. I think the caveat on it would be, when I'm talking to people, like, who are they in their relationship with, or who are they about to get into the relationship with? And obviously I don't know that if I'm not working with a couple, I'm working with an individual, which is sort of where our focus has tended to be during this conversation, hasn't it? But that's my caveat. Like, are you with someone who is, engaged in a similar process, who's safe to be around, who wants sort of roughly the same as you? So we're not talking about someone perfect. We're not talking about somebody who doesn't lose their patience sometimes, but we are talking about somebody who is, decent and forgiving and assumes best intent and all of those sorts of things. The quality of the relationship really can't exceed the, character of the least mature, least admirable participant. And I think that can get you in trouble. Like, if you're with someone like that, that's sometimes what I'm flagging up to people. So it's the other end of the spectrum, or the other side of the coin, people who are determined to persist in a dysfunctional relationship, and a difficult relationship, in a relationship which is super stressful and hard work for them, because they think they should be practicing, or they think they should be able to cope with those things, and actually they're being met with unkindness,
or they're terrified of being alone.
Yeah. And those things will be worth pointing out. I think it's a bit that therapy can do. It's like, actually there is a terrified of being alone bit, or there is a, I'm banging my head against the wall, or this is sort of self-harming. Why am I so willing to keep injuring myself, or to keep being spoken to in a certain fashion, or to keep being let down? That's, I think, a useful it's a way in which therapy is genuinely useful and different from a friendship, because your friends are, they either know that person and they quite like them, or they know them and they don't particularly like them, or they don't know them and they just instinctively take your side. And I think therapy's trying to do, a bunch more than that.
Say a little bit, we lost an important point, I think, that you were making earlier, about people tend to end up with others who have a similar kind of emotional maturity. Say a bit more about that, what you meant. And because you just almost explained a relationship where that wasn't true, right? That one person had a level of emotional maturity that the other wouldn't. And part of the self-reflection is about, why are you in a relationship with someone who doesn't match your level of emotional maturity?
I suppose the first observation is that generally I would say people are in those relationships. When I see couples, it's really rare that I see one person who's clearly got it together and is able to state what they want clearly and succinctly without any lectures or anything else. And they're with somebody who is tempestuous or utterly withdrawn or avoiding that. There's usually some yin and yang, some push, some pull. So I was just going to pause there and see whether you recognize that. You're sort of smiling and nodding. So I'm guessing so.
Yes, yeah. Apart from in the dynamic you were just explaining, where there seems to be a little bit of masochistic behavior for whatever reason that you want to explore why you're putting yourself through that. That again might reflect family of origin issues or messages that someone's received about self-respect, but is useful to explore. But generally, I'm with you. I think that you tend to be drawn to and attracted by someone that's going to be able to show levels of vulnerability and respect you when you're showing your imperfections and is willing to kind of help you learn as well. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it? That you got to use the sporting analogy again, you got a kind of playing field, right? And you're both on the playing field and you're both trying to learn together rather than see it as one person's completely immovable while the other person's trying to learn.
Yeah, it made me think of tennis, and you can't, or chess if you prefer. You can't really have a good game of chess or tennis against somebody who's no good or somebody who's so much better than you. It's just an unenjoyable experience. I think it's something that sort of instinctively makes sense about that. I think also if we use the language of attachment, if somebody is secure and they do have their act together and they've had an upbringing which has allowed them to experience, the good and the bad in relationships, rough with the smooth, being able to repair after things have broken down, all of those things, show affection, be straightforward with their emotions, they're not going to want to be around somebody who can't do that. They're not going to be around somebody who wants to play games with them or keep them waiting or, endlessly treat them poorly. They would immediately identify that this is not what I'm used to. This doesn't feel like habit. This doesn't feel right. I'm going to break things off. So I think that's the other way in which that works, that if you were by accident with a secure person, somebody who's much further down the journey than you, they would probably be like, this is not for me. I don't recognize this. It's not good. I don't like it.
Good. Any final football analogies before we finish?
No, I think that will probably.
I got one. I got one.
Yeah, go on.
You hear of so many extremely talented footballers that don't make it, right? They don't make it because they've worked on their individual skills for hours and hours and hours and hours. But as soon as you get them onto a pitch with 10 others, not the best at playing as a team. And I know it's a bit of a stretched analogy, but it is going back to the beginning of our conversation that there's a limit to what you can do on your own if you want to be in good relationships. You can take responsibility for the core bits, but most of the time you're in a relationship with another person. That's going to bring out your emotions. That's going to show you what you need to work on in a different way that I think is hard for 90% or so of what we talk about. I think it's quite hard to do completely on your own.
Yeah, I agree. It's a nice place to finish. I was just going to offer one more thing, which probably won't top what you've said, but I've started now. I'm
Always got to have the last word. Go on.
I'm listening to Dave's new album, which is called "The Boy Who Played the Harp" with my.
This is where you're going to try and win brownie points for being on top of modern music.
Modern culture, a bit of UK drill. This particular song is called "Rain Dance," and it's a very it's critically acclaimed album. People are loving it from all sections of society. So if you're not massive for UK drill, you should probably still give it a listen. And the song that we're liking at the moment is called Rain Dance, and it's sort of about a fledgling relationship. And the rain dance is sort of, he's kind of cooling down the love. He's very wary of him. And he says something like, growing up, I didn't see no marriages. And it's a really sweet sort of go at describing, I think, what it's like to be in a relationship when you haven't had those examples. And it sort of feels like the first time, or it feels really real this time, and how you'd step into that and, some of what feels difficult and what goes wrong, and giving yourself over to it as well.
Good. Tune in next time for more UK drill. So, good to see you, Matt.
Yeah, nice to see you.
See you next time.